In the autumn of 1864, the sun set crimson over the Colorado plains, a haunting foreshadowing of the blood that would soon stain its golden grasses. America was at war with itself. The Civil War raged in the East, tearing a nation apart. But far from the major battlefields of Gettysburg and Atlanta, another darker conflict brewed, one not between North and South, but between the expanding United States and the native peoples of the Great Plains. This was the frontier, a land of buffalo, vast horizons, and fragile peace treaties. Yet for the Cheyenne and Arapaho who roamed the Colorado Territory, the arrival of white settlers under the promise of gold and land meant the slow death of their world. The discovery of gold near Pikes Peak in 1858 brought thousands of settlers pouring into Colorado. Cutting across traditional hunting grounds and sacred spaces, treaties had been made and broken with ruthless efficiency. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851 had promised vast territories to the tribes. But by 1861, a new agreement, the Treaty of Fort Wise, reduced those lands to a fraction of their original size, forcing the Cheyenne and Arapaho into a barren reservation along Sand Creek. Many tribal leaders, desperate to avoid starvation and war, reluctantly signed. Others, like the proud Cheyenne dog soldiers, refused. To them, this was betrayal. The growing tension soon erupted into violence. Raids and retaliation spread across the plains. Settlers demanded protection. The U.S. military, already consumed by the Civil War, saw the frontier as a sideshow, yet one that needed to be silenced quickly. Into this turmoil stepped a man whose name would forever be stained by infamy, Colonel John Milton Chivington. Chivington was no ordinary soldier. He had once been a Methodist preacher, a booming voice from the pulpit turned into a commander's shout. During the early years of the Civil War, he had earned fame for leading Union troops at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, stopping a Confederate invasion of New Mexico. But ambition consumed him. He wanted higher command, glory, and headlines. To him, the path to that glory lay not on the battlefields of Virginia, but on the windswept plains of Colorado. The territorial governor, John Evans, shared Chivington's obsession with ridding the land of what they called Indian threats. When panic spread through Denver after a series of raids, Evans issued a chilling proclamation. All friendly Indians were to report to designated forts for protection. Those who did not would be treated as hostile. One Cheyenne chief, Black Kettle, believed peace was still possible. He took his people to the military post at Fort Lyon and met with U.S. officials. They told him to make camp along nearby Sand Creek until further orders came. Trusting their word, Black Kettle raised two flags above his lodge, the American flag and a white flag of truce, believing they would protect his people. But protection never came. Instead, death was on its way. On the cold morning of November 29, 1864, before dawn, Colonel Chivington led nearly 700 men of the Colorado 3rd Regiment, mostly local volunteers, toward the sleeping camp at Sand Creek. They had been told it was a hostile village, but in truth, it was filled with families, women, children, elders, perhaps 200 people in all. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, Black Kettle's wife saw movement, riders in the distance. The chief rushed outside, holding the flags high, shouting to the soldiers that they were peaceful. But the men did not stop. Chivington raised his arm and gave the order that would live in infamy: kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. And the thunder began. The soldiers opened fire with rifles and cannons. Bullets tore through the lodges. Warriors grabbed what few weapons they had to defend their families. Women fled toward the creek, clutching babies, seeking shelter, but the soldiers rode them down. The village erupted in chaos: smoke, screams, flames, and blood. For hours, the troops slaughtered indiscriminately. They mutilated the dead, scalping them, cutting off limbs, and even children's bodies for trophies. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. When it was over, more than 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho were dead, 2/3 of them women and children. Chivington and his men returned to Denver as heroes. They paraded through the streets with body parts displayed as war trophies. Newspapers at first called it a great victory, the triumph of civilization over savagery. But whispers soon began to spread. Some of Chivington's own officers could no longer stomach the lies. Captain Silas Sowell, a man of conscience, had refused to order his men to fire. What he saw that day haunted him. In letters, he described women and children waving white flags, begging for mercy, and being shot down. His testimony, along with that of other soldiers, exposed the truth to the nation. In 1865, 3 separate investigations were launched by the U.S. Army, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, and the Department of the Interior. All reached the same damning conclusion. Sand Creek was not a battle. It was an unprovoked massacre. The committees condemned Chivington's actions as foul, cowardly, and dastardly. Chivington resigned before he could be court-martialed, escaping formal punishment but losing his reputation forever. Captain Silas Sowell, who had bravely testified against him, was shot and killed in Denver not long afterward, almost certainly by men loyal to Chivington. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, Sand Creek changed everything. It destroyed any remaining trust between native tribes and the United States. Even those who had sought peace now saw only betrayal. Retaliation came swiftly. In the years that followed, the plains erupted in war, a brutal cycle of raids, massacres, and retribution that would burn across the West for decades. For Chief Black Kettle, the tragedy did not end at Sand Creek. 4 years later, he and his wife were killed in another surprise attack. This time, led by General George Armstrong Custer at the Washita River in 1868. Once again, he had raised the American flag in peace. Once again, it brought only death. The Sand Creek Massacre became one of the darkest stains on America's history, a moment when the promise of liberty and the pursuit of manifest destiny collided with unimaginable cruelty. For generations, the story was silenced, reduced to a footnote in textbooks, mislabeled as a battle. But the survivors and their descendants never forgot. Through stories, songs, and ceremonies, they kept the memory alive. In time, America began to face the truth. In the year 2000, the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site was established in southeastern Colorado, preserving the land where so many died. Each year, Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants make a remembrance run from the massacre site to Denver, retracing their ancestors' footsteps, turning grief into strength and silence into remembrance. The Sand Creek Massacre forces America to confront its own paradox, how a nation that claimed liberty and equality could carry out such acts under the same flag. In 1864, while Union soldiers fought to end slavery in the East, other soldiers massacred peaceful native families in the West. It was a contradiction written in blood. But to remember Sand Creek is to reclaim dignity for those who perished there. It is to face the truth of how America expanded, not just through bravery and innovation, but also through violence and betrayal. Today, the winds still whisper across the Colorado plains. The creek runs quiet, its waters moving past cottonwoods that stand like silent witnesses. Beneath that soil lie the echoes of screams, of courage, of sorrow. They remind us that history's ghosts do not rest until their truths are spoken. The Sand Creek Massacre stands as a warning that fear, prejudice, and ambition can twist noble banners into symbols of terror. And it stands as a call to remember, to reconcile, and to never again let the innocent be slaughtered under the name of progress. November 29, 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado. May we remember, so that it may never happen again. The year was 1858. The winds of change swept across the Colorado plains, carrying with them the promise and the curse of gold. When gold was discovered near Pikes Peak, thousands of settlers poured westward, hungry for fortune, cutting deep into the heart of the Great Plains. Covered wagons rolled where buffalo once roamed, and towns sprang up where tribal hunting camps had stood for generations. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations, this invasion of their homeland was a slow-motion disaster. The land was their life, the rivers their lifeblood, the plains their church, the buffalo their survival. But now, those same plains echoed with the sound of wagon wheels, gunfire, and hammers building a new world, a world that had no place for them. For centuries, the tribes of the plains had lived by the rhythms of nature. They followed the herds, honored the seasons, and kept peace with one another through tradition and balance. But that fragile balance shattered when the gold seekers came. And with them came the government-bearing treaties, promises, and paper lines that carved the land like a knife. In 1851, the United States had signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, granting vast territories to the tribe's lands stretching across modern-day Colorado, Wyoming, and Kansas. It was supposed to bring peace between settlers and native peoples. But like so many promises made to native nations, it was written in disappearing ink. As more settlers flooded west, Washington saw the treaty as an inconvenience, an obstacle to expansion. And so, just 10 years later, another treaty was forced upon the tribes, the Treaty of Fort Wise, signed in 1861. This new treaty was devastating. It took away nearly all of the Cheyenne and Arapaho's ancestral lands, reducing them to a small, key reservation along Sand Creek, a strip of land in southeastern Colorado that could barely support life. Many tribal leaders, desperate to save their people from starvation and further violence, reluctantly signed, believed that compromise might bring peace, that if they showed goodwill, the United States would honor its word. But not all agreed. Among the Cheyenne were fierce warriors known as the Dog Soldiers, men who lived by a strict code of honor and would rather die than surrender their homeland. They saw the Treaty of Fort Wise for what it truly was, a betrayal. To them, the signatures on that paper were the death marks of a people's freedom. Tensions rose. Raids began, small at first, then deadly. Settlers, frightened and angry, demanded protection. They wanted the army to act, to drive the tribes away, to make the frontier safe for their farms, their towns, their dreams. The U.S. military, stretched thin by the Civil War raging back east, viewed the conflict on the plains as a distraction, a sideshow in a nation already bleeding. But in Colorado, where fear spread faster than truth, the cries for vengeance grew too loud to ignore. Into this cauldron of greed, fear, and vengeance stepped a man whose name would forever be linked to infamy, Colonel John Milton Chivington. Chivington was a man of contradictions, a preacher turned soldier, a man of God who would soon commit one of the most godless acts in American history. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a booming voice, he had once been called the Fighting Parson. During the early Civil War years, he earned fame for leading Union troops to victory at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, halting Confederate forces in New Mexico. That victory made him a hero. But for Chivington, it was not enough. He wanted more glory, more power, more recognition. And on the frontier, the surest path to fame was to destroy what white settlers called the Indian Menace. Colorado's territorial governor, John Evans, shared Chivington's hunger for control. Together, they fanned the flames of fear. They warned settlers that the tribes were rising in rebellion, that every campfire on the horizon was a threat, every rider on the plains a potential attacker. Evans declared that any native people not under the protection of a fort were to be treated as hostile. In effect, he made peace impossible. The Cheyenne and Arapaho divided between those who sought peace and those who sought resistance. Faced impossible choices, some, like Chief Black Kettle, still believed in diplomacy. They moved their families to the designated reservation areas, flying white flags of truce, hoping that faith in American promises might protect them. Others, young, angry, and desperate, joined the Dog Soldiers, striking back at settlers and supply trains in acts of vengeance. By 1864, the frontier had become a powder keg. Every skirmish, every rumor, every spark brought it closer to explosion. The people of Denver demanded blood, Politicians saw opportunity. And Chivington saw his chance, his opportunity to ride back into the spotlight, to make headlines as Colorado's defender. He began preparing his volunteer regiment, men roughened by frontier life, driven by fear, hatred, and promises of vengeance. Many of them had lost family or property in earlier raids. Few had any understanding of who they were really fighting. The stage was set. Two worlds stood on the edge of catastrophe, one born from the ancient rhythms of the plains, the other from the fever of expansion. Between them lay Sand Creek, a small ribbon of water winding through the dry prairie. Neither side could know that soon it would become a river of blood. And as Colonel John Milton Chivington mounted his horse and looked east toward the horizon, he did not see families seeking peace. He saw his own destiny and a chance to carve his name into the annals of history. But history would remember him for something else entirely, for the horror that would unfold in the dawn light of November 29, 1864. For now, in the final days before the massacre, tension hung heavy over the Colorado plains, like the still air before a storm. The treaties had failed. The peace had broken. The frontier was about to learn that even in a land of endless skies, there was no escape from the shadows of human cruelty. The year was 1864. The Civil War was tearing the American Republic apart, but in the Colorado Territory, another war was quietly being prepared. Not against the Confederacy, but against the people who had lived on those lands for centuries, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. Colonel John Milton Chivington, a man once praised as a hero of the Union cause, now saw himself on a new battlefield, one that would not bring honor, but infamy. He was tall and commanding, with cold blue eyes and a booming preacher's voice that could fill a church or command a regiment. But beneath the righteous words lay ambition, raw, burning, and dangerous. He had tasted fame once, after the Battle of Glorieta Pass in 1862, where his troops halted a Confederate invasion from Texas. Denver newspapers had hailed him as the savior of the West. But as the Civil War dragged on and his star began to fade, Chivington grew restless. The fight against the Confederacy was shifting eastward. The real battles were being won and lost far away. In the mountains and plains of Colorado, he feared he would be forgotten. Then came an opportunity, not born from glory, but from fear. Settlers across the territory began reporting raids, wagon trains ambushed, cattle stolen, telegraph lines cut, families murdered. Many of these reports were exaggerated, some even invented, but panic spread like wildfire. Denver's newspapers cried out for protection. Politicians seized on the outrage, and Chivington, ever the opportunist, saw a path to resurrect his fame. The territory's governor, John Evans, shared Chivington's thirst for recognition. Evans was a shrewd politician, appointed by President Lincoln himself, and he wanted to prove that Colorado could defend itself, that its settlers were strong, loyal, and ready for statehood. Together, Evans and Chivington forged a dangerous alliance of ambition and fear. In the summer of 1864, Evans issued a chilling proclamation, the Proclamation of July 27th. It declared that all friendly Indians must report to designated forts to receive protection from the Army. But there was a cruel catch. Those who failed to comply would be considered hostile and treated as enemies of the United States. It was, in essence, a death sentence for anyone who refused to surrender their freedom. The proclamation gave Chivington the authority he craved, legal cover for an extermination campaign. He began recruiting a new regiment of volunteers, the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, known locally as the 100 Daysers because they enlisted for just 100 days. Most were miners, ranchers, and frontiersmen, hardened by life in the territory and fueled by vengeance. Many had lost loved ones to raids, others sought revenge for imagined wrongs, and some simply wanted adventure or pay. Chivington filled their heads with fiery sermons about duty and destiny. He called the tribes savages, thieves, and murderers. He preached that the only way to secure peace was through destruction. And when he spoke, men listened. Governor Evans, meanwhile, fanned the flames. He sent messages to Washington, painting the frontier as a region under siege. He warned of Indian conspiracies, describing the Cheyenne and Arapaho as allies of the Confederacy, a lie meant to justify what he and Chivington were planning. But not everyone in Colorado believed the propaganda. At Fort Lyon, a remote outpost on the Arkansas River, some officers still held faith in diplomacy. They had spoken with tribal leaders like Chief Black Kettle and Chief White Antelope, who sought peace and safety for their people. Black Kettle had already taken Evans's words seriously, leading his band to the fort and pledging loyalty to the Union. Black Kettle's message was simple: "We have made peace with you. We want to live in friendship." He was told by Major Edward Wynkoop, the fort's commander at the time, that if he and his people camped along Sand Creek, flying both a white flag and an American flag over their lodge, they would be safe. Wynkoop, a man of conscience, believed in the promise of peace. But as fate would have it, Wynkoop was soon replaced by a new commander more willing to follow Chivington's orders. The fragile line between safety and slaughter began to vanish. By the autumn of 1864, the 3rd Colorado Cavalry was restless. They had trained for months, but seen no combat. Their enlistment term was nearly up, and Chivington feared his chance for glory was slipping away. Then came the news he had been waiting for. Reports that a large group of Cheyenne and Arapaho were camped along Sand Creek. To Chivington, it didn't matter that they were peaceful. It didn't matter that they had been promised protection. All that mattered was that they were there, vulnerable, visible, and close enough to strike. He began preparing his men for what he called a campaign of justice. Under the cover of night, Chivington gave rousing speeches to his troops. He told them the tribes at Sand Creek were responsible for raids, for murders, for the terror of the frontier. He told them that to spare them would invite future bloodshed. And he told them that this was their moment, their chance to defend Colorado and secure their names in history. "Kill and scalp all, big and little," he said. "Nits make lice." Those words, chilling in their cruelty, became the battle cry that would echo through history. On November 28, 1864, the 3rd Colorado Cavalry rode out of Fort Lyon under Chivington's command. Nearly 700 men, armed with rifles, pistols, and howitzers, made their way across the cold prairie. The moon was high, the air sharp and silent. Their horses' hooves thudded softly against the frozen ground as they moved toward Sand Creek. Inside the peaceful encampment, Black Kettle's people slept, unaware that death was coming. Women cradled their children. Fires burned low. The flags of truce, one white, one American, fluttered quietly in the night breeze. They believed they were under the protection of the United States government. They believed in the promises made to them. They believed the morning would bring peace. But for Chivington and his men, morning would bring blood. As the first light of dawn began to rise, the soldiers took their positions along the ridge overlooking the camp. Chivington looked down on the village through the cold haze of dawn. Smoke from the cook fires curled into the pale sky. He could see the lodges, the people moving about, unaware. He turned to his officers and gave a simple order: advance. What happened next would become one of the darkest chapters in American history. A massacre disguised as a victory. A betrayal cloaked in the flag of peace. But in that moment, as the cavalry began its descent, no one thought of history. They thought only of glory, revenge, and survival. Colonel Chivington rode at the front, the man who once preached of God's mercy, now leading men into merciless slaughter. His ambition had blinded him. His name would forever be spoken in the same breath as Sand Creek, a name soaked in the blood of the innocent. The storm was coming. And when it broke, the plains would never be the same again. The massacre at dawn, November 29, 1864, the sun had not yet risen. The plains of southeastern Colorado lay silent beneath a veil of frost, the faint glow of dawn still hidden behind the distant ridges. Along the quiet banks of Sand Creek, hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children slept beneath buffalo hide lodges. The air was still, the sky pale with the first light of morning. For them, it was a moment of fragile peace, a peace they believed had been promised. At the center of the camp stood the lodge of Chief Black Kettle, a man of peace who still believed that words could protect his people more than weapons ever could. Above his lodge flew the flags, the stars and stripes of the United States and a white flag of truce, symbols of friendship, given to him by American officers at Fort Lyon. Those flags fluttered gently in the morning wind. The same wind that would soon carry the sound of death. Just beyond the horizon, the earth trembled under the hooves of nearly 700 men. Colonel John Milton, Chivington's Colorado 3rd Regiment. They moved like shadows, rifles glinting in the moonlight, faces hard with anticipation. They had ridden all night, fueled by hatred and by lies, believing they were striking a blow against enemies of the Union. In truth, they were marching toward a village of peace. At dawn, Chivington halted his men on a low ridge overlooking the encampment. Below them, smoke rose from small morning fires. Dogs barked faintly. Children played near the creek. The first golden rays of sunlight began to break over the plains. Chivington turned to his officers, his voice cold and sharp. "Men, there are your Indians. Take your pick of them. Kill and scalp, all big and little. Nits make lice." The words fell like poison into the morning air. And then, with a single motion of his arm, he gave the order to advance. The stillness of dawn shattered. Cannon fire exploded from the ridge, thundering across the plains. Shells ripped through the lodges. Horses screamed. Chaos erupted as soldiers charged down the slope, firing wildly into the village. Bullets tore through skin and hide alike. The earth shook beneath the fury of gunfire and galloping hooves. Black Kettle rushed from his lodge, clutching the American flag, shouting that his people were friendly, that they were under protection. His voice was lost in the roar of musket fire. His wife, wounded, fell beside him. Women and children ran toward the creek, waving white cloths, screaming for mercy. There was none. The soldiers fired into the fleeing crowd. They shot mothers carrying infants, children hiding in the brush, old men who could barely run. Warriors tried desperately to defend the camp with bows and a few old rifles, but it was hopeless. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. The water of Sand Creek turned red. As the hours passed, the massacre became an orgy of horror. Soldiers dragged women from hiding places, shot them at point-blank range, and mutilated the dead. Some cut off scalps, others took fingers and ears as trophies. They paraded the corpses with grotesque pride. It was not war, it was butchery. Chief White Antelope, an old leader of peace, stood tall before the soldiers. Refusing to run, he sang his death song. Nothing lives long except the earth and the mountains. Moments later, he was gunned down where he stood. The attack raged for hours. By midday, the camp was in ruins, lodges burned to ashes, the air thick with smoke and the stench of blood. The cries of the dying mixed with the shouts of men drunk on vengeance. The cavalry looted what little remained, blankets, jewelry, weapons, and set the village ablaze. When the killing finally stopped, over 150 people were dead, most of them women and children. Those who survived wandered the frozen prairie, wounded and terrified. Their world turned to ashes. Chivington rode among the dead, surveying the destruction with grim satisfaction. To him, it was victory. He ordered his men to gather trophies from the bodies, scalps, ears, and even body parts to display when they returned to Denver. That night, as the flames of the burning village lit the plains, the survivors buried their dead in shallow graves. Mothers wept over lifeless children. Warriors mourned without words. And the creek that once carried life through the prairie now carried only sorrow. When the regiment returned to Denver, the city greeted them as heroes. Chivington led a parade through the streets. His men waved their grisly trophies before cheering crowds. Newspapers hailed the Battle of Sand Creek as a great victory over hostile Indians. But truth has a way of cutting through lies. Soon, word began to spread, whispered first by soldiers who had seen too much, who could not live with what they had done. Captain Silas Sowell, one of Chivington's own officers, had refused to let his company fire. What he witnessed that day haunted him. In letters to friends, he described the horror, the killing of women clutching white flags, the slaughter of children, the mutilations. Sowell's words reached Washington. Shock turned to outrage. The government could not ignore it. Investigations were launched by the U.S. Army, by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, and by the Department of the Interior. Their findings were damning. They called Sand Creek what it was: a massacre, foul and dastardly, an unprovoked slaughter of innocents. Chivington, sensing his career collapsing, resigned from the Army before he could be court-martialed. He escaped formal punishment, but his name was forever stained. History would never forget him, not as a hero, but as a murderer. Captain Silas Sowell, the man who spoke the truth, paid for his courage with his life. Months after testifying against Chivington, he was shot dead on the streets of Denver, silenced, many believed, by men loyal to Chivington. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the wound never healed. The massacre at Sand Creek destroyed any remaining trust in the United States government. Even chiefs who had once sought peace turned to war. The plains erupted in blood once again as vengeance swept across the frontier. Chief Black Kettle survived the massacre that day, but fate was cruel. 4 years later, in 1868, he was killed by U.S. troops in another surprise attack, the Battle of the Washita River, led by General George Armstrong Custer. Once again, Black Kettle had raised the American flag in peace. Once again, it brought only death. The story of Sand Creek became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror reflecting the darkest truths of America's expansion. The same nation that fought for freedom and equality in the Civil War had, at the very same time, massacred peaceful Native families under its own flag. For over a century, the Sand Creek Massacre was buried in silence. Textbooks called it a battle. Monuments ignored it. But the descendants of those who survived kept the memory alive in stories, songs, and ceremonies that refused to let the truth die. And slowly, America began to listen. In 2000, Congress established the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, preserving the land where the blood was shed. Today, it stands as both memorial and warning, a place of grief, remembrance, and reckoning. Each year, descendants of the survivors make a remembrance run from Sand Creek to Denver, a journey of hundreds of miles. They run not for vengeance, but for truth, carrying the memory of their ancestors in their hearts and footsteps. The prairie is quiet now. The wind still whispers across the grasses where so many fell. The creek flows again, calm and shallow, beneath the wide Colorado sky. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes, the shouts, the gunfire, the cries, fading into the horizon. They remind us of what happens when hatred blinds justice, when ambition overrides humanity, when peace is betrayed in the name of progress. November 29, 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado. A day when the dawn broke red, and the promise of peace died beneath the American flag. May we remember, so that it may never happen again. Aftermath, justice, and the legacy of Sand Creek, the smoke had settled. The gunfire had stopped. But the silence that followed the Sand Creek Massacre was not peace. It was the silence of shock, of grief, and of betrayal, too deep for words. When the soldiers of the Colorado 3rd Regiment rode away from Sand Creek that November day in 1864, they left behind not an enemy camp, but a field of death. The ground was littered with burned lodges, lifeless bodies, and shattered faith. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, The land that had once been a place of life and community became a graveyard. In the days that followed, the survivors, mostly women and children, gathered what strength they had to bury their dead. The frozen ground made it almost impossible. Many bodies were left where they fell, exposed to the wind and wolves. Mothers wept over the remains of their children. Elders sang songs to guide the spirits home. And above the quiet creek, the flags of peace still fluttered, torn, blood-stained, and meaningless. Yet, while grief consumed the plains, Denver celebrated. Colonel John Milton Chivington returned as a self-proclaimed hero. His regiment paraded through the streets, cheered by crowds who believed they had avenged Colorado's frontier settlers. Behind them, soldiers carried the spoils of their slaughter scalps. Limbs and other grisly trophies displayed as proof of victory. But even as the cheers echoed, whispers began. Not everyone in Chivington's command had joined the killing. Some soldiers had refused to fire. Others, horrified by what they saw, spoke quietly to friends and family of the truth. Among them was Captain Silas Sowell, a man whose conscience refused to be silenced. Sowell had stood on the ridge that morning watching the slaughter unfold and ordered his men to hold their fire. What he witnessed, he later wrote, would haunt him forever. In letters sent east, Sowell described the massacre, the women and children waving white flags, the mutilations, the desecration. It was hard to see little children on their knees begging for mercy and then have their brains beaten out, he wrote. His words cut through the fog of lies. Soon, other officers followed, testifying that Sand Creek had not been a battle, but a massacre of innocents. Word spread quickly to Washington. The Union government, already weary from years of civil war, was now faced with a new scandal, one that stained the very flag it fought to defend. In early 1865, 3 official investigations were launched, one by the U.S. Army, one by the Department of the Interior, and one by Congress's Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Their findings were unanimous. Sand Creek had been an unprovoked attack, a slaughter of peaceful people who had been promised protection under the American flag. The Joint Committee's report was especially damning. It declared that the Sand Creek Massacre was a foul and dastardly massacre, one that disgraced the age and the nation. Witness after witness described the atrocities, the killing of women and children, the taking of scalps and body parts, the cruelty of men driven by hate. But justice, in the end, never came. Chivington, sensing the storm closing in, resigned from the army before he could be court-martialed. Without an active commission, he was beyond military law. He escaped punishment. He would spend the rest of his life defending his actions, insisting he had saved the frontier. But history would remember him differently. His name became synonymous with betrayal. Governor John Evans, who had issued the proclamation that set the massacre in motion, was forced to resign. Yet he, too, would live out his days without facing trial. Like so many architects of injustice, he was shielded by time and politics. The man who told the truth, Captain Silas Sowell, did not live long enough to see even this small measure of reckoning. Only months after testifying before federal investigators, Sowell was shot and killed on the streets of Denver. His murderer escaped. Many believed it was Chivington's supporters who silenced him. Sowell's death closed one chapter, but it could not silence the memory of Sand Creek. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the massacre marked the end of faith in treaties and peace talks. Even those who had once sought friendship now turned to vengeance. Across the Great Plains, the news of Sand Creek spread from camp to camp among the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Lakota Sioux. The war drums beat once more. In the years that followed, the plains erupted in conflict. The survivors of Sand Creek joined warriors who attacked forts, wagon trains, and settlements, a wave of retribution known as the Plains Wars. To the tribes, it was not aggression, it was survival, an answer to betrayal written in fire. But the United States responded with overwhelming force. One by one, the tribes were defeated, their lands seized, their people confined to distant reservations. Sand Creek had become both a wound and a warning, a symbol of the cost of trusting, promises made in Washington and broken on the frontier. As the decades passed, time tried to bury the massacre beneath layers of forgetfulness. Textbooks called it a battle. Monuments celebrated men like Chivington as pioneers. The story of Sand Creek faded from public memory, surviving only in the oral traditions of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Grandparents told the children what the world preferred to forget of the soldiers, the fire, the betrayal, and the creek that ran red. For generations, they carried that truth alone, but the truth, like the land, endures. It cannot be erased, only rediscovered. In the 20th century, historians began to revisit the tragedy, uncovering the testimonies, letters, and reports long hidden in archives. Slowly, the full horror of Sand Creek emerged again, and with it, the voices of those who had been silenced. In the 1990s, renewed efforts led by Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants sought official recognition and preservation of the massacre site. Their work, their persistence, led to a long-overdue act of justice. In 2000, Congress passed legislation creating the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, preserving the land where the massacre occurred. It stands today in southeastern Colorado, near the quiet banks of Sand Creek, a place of mourning, memory, and truth. Here, the prairie stretches endlessly. Just as it did in 1864, the wind carries the sound of rustling grass, and the earth still bears faint traces of that day, the scattered artifacts of lives interrupted. The site is sacred ground, tended not by soldiers or settlers, but by the descendants of those who perished there. Every year, runners from the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations make the long remembrance run, a journey of over 180 miles from Sand Creek to Denver. They run not for revenge, but for remembrance. With each step, they honor their ancestors and reclaim the story that was once stolen from them. At dawn, as they set out, elders pray to the rising sun. They carry the names of the fallen black kettle, white antelope, and the hundreds of others in their hearts. They run through the same land where their ancestors once fled, transforming a landscape of tragedy into one of resilience. For the people of the plains, Sand Creek is not just history, it is memory, blood, and legacy. And for America, it remains an unhealed scar, a reminder of what happens when fear becomes policy, when ambition outweighs humanity, when the flag of peace is betrayed by the hands that raise it. Yet there is hope in remembrance, because to remember is to resist forgetting, and in that resistance lies the first step toward truth and reconciliation. The Sand Creek Massacre, once buried in silence, now stands as a testament not only to what was lost, but to what must never be lost again. Today, as the sun rises over the Colorado plains, the wind whispers across the tall grasses, carrying voices from long ago. If you stand at the site and listen closely, you can almost hear them, the songs of mourning, the cries of the children, the prayers of the survivors. The land remembers, and it asks us to remember too. November 29, 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado. A moment of horror, a century of silence, and at last, a promise that their story will never again be forgotten. The smoke of Sand Creek had long faded, but its echo rolled across the Great Plains like distant thunder. What happened on that cold November morning in 1864 did not end with the dead. It lived on in the hearts of the survivors and in the fury of an entire people. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, Sand Creek changed everything. It was more than a massacre. It was the breaking of faith, the final shattering proof that peace with the United States was an illusion. The promises written on paper had turned to ash, the words of friendship to lies. The flags that once symbolized protection now stood for betrayal. Even Chief Black Kettle, a man of peace, found himself caught in a world where peace no longer existed. He had believed that the American flag would shield his people, that by showing loyalty and surrender, they could live without fear. But at Sand Creek, he had watched soldiers slaughter his people beneath that same flag. The lesson was bitter and clear. The United States could not be trusted. The massacre ignited a fire that would sweep across the plains. In 1865, the survivors of Sand Creek fled north to join their relatives, the northern Cheyenne and Lakota Sioux, along the Powder River country. Their warriors gathered in council. Round the flickering light of the campfire, the names of the dead were spoken, and the vow of vengeance was made. From that vow was born the next great conflict, the Plains Wars. Throughout 1865 and 1866, a wave of retribution spread across the frontier. Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux war parties attacked wagon trains, military outposts, and settlements. To the settlers, it was savagery, was justice. They struck at dawn, burning supply lines, capturing horses, and reclaiming what had been stolen, their dignity, their land, and their vengeance. Settlers fled eastward, terrified of what they called the Indian uprisings. But for the tribes, it was not uprising, it was resistance. The U.S. military, weary from the Civil War, now turned its gaze westward. Generals who had fought at Gettysburg and Vicksburg were sent to the plains to bring what Washington called peace. Peace by the sword. They built forts deep into native lands. They sent out columns of cavalry to hunt the same people they had once promised to protect. The frontier descended into a spiral of violence, a cycle of raids and retaliations that would last for decades. Each side called the other barbaric. Each side justified its cruelty as justice. And through it all, the memory of Sand Creek lingered like a curse. To the tribes, it became a symbol, a wound that never healed. Mothers told their children the story of the massacre so they would never forget. Warriors painted the red streaks of Sand Creek on their faces before battle, a mark of mourning and revenge. For the United States, Sand Creek was an embarrassment, a scandal whispered in Washington, a shadow on the nation's conscience. Politicians called for reform, but the machine of expansion did not stop. Railroads pushed west. Homesteaders came by the thousands. And with them came the soldiers, fort by fort, road by road, forcing the Plains tribes into smaller and smaller corners of their own land. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 tried once again to promise peace, granting the Sioux control over the Black Hills and other lands in the northern plains. But peace built on broken promises cannot last. And the ink was barely dry before new gold discoveries and new greed tore it apart again. For Black Kettle, the man who had survived Sand Creek, tragedy followed him like a shadow. After the massacre, he and the remnants of his band moved south to what is now Oklahoma, determined to live quietly. He continued to believe that coexistence was possible. Again and again, he sought peace. Again and again, he was betrayed. In November of 1868, almost exactly 4 years after Sand Creek Black, Kettle and his wife camped with their people along the Washita River in present-day western Oklahoma. It was winter, snow covered the ground. The village was small, poor, and weary. Above his lodge, once again, Black Kettle raised the American flag, the same flag that had flown at Sand Creek. To him, it was still a symbol of trust. But to others, it was a target. At dawn on November 27, 1868, the U.S. 7th Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, descended upon the camp. They claimed it was a strike against hostile warriors. In reality, it was another massacre. Custer's men opened fire without warning. The village was surrounded, the riverbanks echoing with gunshots and screams. Black Kettle and his wife tried to flee across the frozen Washita, but they were both shot and killed, the chief falling beside the woman who had stood with him through every broken promise. Once again, the flag of peace had brought only death. The Battle of the Washita River, as it was called, was not a battle at all. It was the grim continuation of Sand Creek, another peaceful village destroyed in the name of security. Another stain on the conscience of a nation. With Black Kettle's death, one of the last great voices of peace among the Southern Cheyenne was silenced. His people were forced into Indian territory, confined to reservations far from the lands they had called home for generations. The buffalo herds were vanishing. The open plains were closing. The frontier was dying, and so was the world of the Plains tribes. Yet the spirit of resistance endured. The young warriors who had survived Sand Creek and Washita would continue to fight in Red Cloud's War. In the Great Sioux War, in the battles that followed, they carried the memory of Sand Creek with them, not as history, but as living fire. Even those who tried to forget could not escape its shadow. Settlers spoke of Indian attacks with fear, but they rarely spoke of what caused them. Politicians in Washington talked of civilization and progress, but behind those words was a truth too heavy to face. The road to America's expansion was paved with the blood of the innocent. Sand Creek had set a precedent that treaties could be broken without consequence, that peace could be offered with one hand and destroyed with the other. It showed that the United States, in its pursuit of destiny, would sacrifice morality to ambition. Decades later, when the Indian Wars finally ended, and the frontier was declared closed, the scars of Sand Creek still remained, not just on the land, but on the soul of a nation. For the Plains tribes, it became a symbol of everything lost: their lands, their freedom, their trust. For America, it became a question that still echoes: what is the cost of progress when it demands the destruction of others? The winds still sweep across the high plains where it all began, whispering through the grass, carrying memories no monument can contain. The ghosts of Sand Creek and Washita do not rest. They walk the prairie at dusk, when the sun turns red and the sky remembers. Their voices are not cries for vengeance. They are reminders. Reminders of the promises broken, the peace betrayed, and the humanity forgotten. And they call out, across the generations, a message as old as time itself. That peace without justice is only silence. And silence, if left unbroken, becomes complicity.